Hello, everybody, and welcome back. My name is Matthew McQuilla, and I am here again with Professor Larry Catá to discuss his book, Hong Kong Between One Country and Two Systems. Today, we will be talking about Chapter 15, Two Systems, Internationalism, Congressional-Executive Commission on China hearings on Hong Kong's Summer of Discontent and the U.S. policy responses. This was written on Tuesday, September 18th, 2019. How are you doing today, Professor?
All right, how are you doing? I hope you're enjoying the summer.
Well, enjoyment of summer ends at the age of, I think, 12, but I am still living through it. I think the heat is really getting to me.
You sound like my grandma.
Hey, that's grandmas have all the wisdom. But speaking of heat, I think that this book is hot off the press now and readily available for everybody. And I think that this chapter is something that would probably be of particular interest to our viewers in the States.
Right, and speaking of heat, and we did not rehearse this, folks who are listening in, we did not rehearse this, although it works really well. Speaking of heat and summer, this chapter is particularly interesting. Now we're in the middle, going into late September. The protests are now old by the measure of these things. And all of a sudden, the Americans start ramping up the heat in ways that I think was a little bit surprising. So it's a kind of fun chapter. By fun, nothing fun, but fun in the sense that all of a sudden, and it's taken June, July, August to the middle of September, 3.5, almost 4 months, for something that looks like not just a coherent, but now a robust and aggressive policy to start coming in, not from where you'd expect, which would be the UK, but from the US.
And so maybe I was going to start with a different question, but maybe I should start with this one. You say not from where you would expect. Why wouldn't they expect this message to come from the US, given the position within, I guess you could say, the Western liberal democracies?
Well, if only because if you look at this from a formal perspective, right, this had been a UK-China problem. That is and a 100 and something year old problem. The ceding of Hong Kong Island, the leases, and their return. That's the arc of the problem over, from the middle of the 19th century to the middle and end of the 20th century. So one would have expected, since it's the British and their 19th century empire and the Chinese and their now reinvigorated state that are at the heart of this, and their relationships, that disentangling, being memorialized in an international instrument, that it would be the British who would be driving this, not just in and for themselves as a principal actor here, but also driving this from the perspective of the international community as well. I mean, it's to be colloquial, although somewhat provocative, it was their problem. That was the way they chose to clean up their mess, and the operational structures they put in was this 1984 Sino British Joint Declaration. The Americans, of course, are the big gorilla in the international arena, and we are in 2019, we're in year 3, I guess, or year 2.5 of the big war is an overwrought term, the big discussion between China and the US over a bunch of things, all under the moniker of trade, but the control of the narrative of trade and trade relationships, competition for influence and driving authority within the international sphere, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so you would expect American presence, but you would have thought at least that you would have started with, if we're on a ball field, you're going to be leading off with your Brit. You're not going to be leading off with the Americans. And yet what we wound up seeing was that we were leading off with somewhat with the international community. We talked the last time with what I thought was a fairly anemic statement from the G7. And then boom, this thing comes. And it's not clear that anyone was prepared for this, especially since this represented something of a change, or perhaps a resolution of some reluctance that had been expressed in the Trump administration, since President Trump had indicated somewhat obliquely that in this context, he was initially not all that unsympathetic to the position of the Chinese with respect to the management of their own territories. And if that was meant to signal the central authorities, you know, that's as good a signal as you can get. But then we have this. And not coming from the Trump administration, but coming from the Congressional-Executive Commission on China.
So let's talk about this leadoff hitter. You have the Congressional-Executive Commission on China. What was the message, as you put it, what was the coherent message that they put out?
All right. Well, let me take a step back for a second, because your question is a good one, but it requires, I think, one tiny step back. Nothing is ever easy in large, complex imperial bureaucracies. We've seen that from the perspective of the central authorities in China, and now we're seeing it from the perspective of the administrative, elected, complex, interlocking systems of officials that make up the American Republic, right? And here what you have is a commission made up of Democrats and Republicans, made up of House and Senate members, who officially are meant to report and drive sentiment, but who have no real authority. All of a sudden, they're the ones who appear to be driving quite publicly the American position. It's not the State Department that's driving this. It's not the Office of the President. It's coming from Congress, and it's coming from a united, what appears to be a more or less united front in Congress. And what they do is they do, and in a sense, they're talking, and then this will get to your question, they're talking to two people simultaneously, which is, of course, what happens when the central authorities are talking in China. They're talking internally and they're talking externally, and by externally and internally, we include Hong Kong somewhere in the middle. When CECC talks, they're talking again in the same way, internally, right? And here they've got to be convincing the executive branch to some extent, and getting the attention of the State Department, and certainly a president who at this point was mercurial and really focused elsewhere when he was thinking about China, right? And at the same time, develop a position that is coherent enough that can be effective as a counter to the position of the Chinese central authorities, and prepackaged, right, provide what the Americans would need in order to move forward. So effectively what you're doing is it's this kind of thing. Oh my God, can't you guys get it together? This is CECC talking to the rest of the American bureaucracy, including its elected officials. Can't you get this thing together? All right, I guess I will have to do it myself. And then coming up with this thing, which they then prepackaged and basically said, okay, so here, take it, now run with it. Eventually, the State Department and the Trump administration do that, but they weren't ahead of this in a sense. The CECC was, and it's for that reason that I pay a lot of attention to what goes on in CECC. But in this case, they developed something that was actually quite interesting, because in a sense, it was a slight slap to the American political hierarchy, but it was a much bigger slap to the other actors, the Chinese authorities, the international community, and obliquely the Brits. You know, where are they? They're Brexiting and doing all these other things. And so What they did was they did it in two, there's two phases to this. One is that they reconstruct the G7 statement into a statement from a passive and subtle statement into a quite simple and straightforward one. Hey folks, I don't know what the Chinese central authorities have been telling you. This is CECC talking. I don't know what the Chinese central authorities were telling you, but we have an international agreement. The international agreement does provide international guarantees and constraints on the way in which the Chinese can exercise their sovereign authority over Hong Kong without disputing their unlimited sovereignty over the territory. It does constrain the way in which that sovereignty can be exercised, pause, at least until 2047, although we'll supersede that, so that this can of the agreement, right? And that the Chinese central authorities violate international agreements. And this is the goodie, by doing that, they show that they are not ready to undertake international leadership because, you know, they're doing the Bismarckian thing. A treaty is worth it's not worth the paper it's printed on. And so how can you aspire to leadership of the international community and respect for international law when you have this kind of cavalier attitude to these expressions of international law, even if it's a quote unquote contract? In this case, the status of this thing was a little murky, but some kind of agreement between these two parties. And then that was the cool thing, number one, from the American perspective. And we were like, whoa, okay, but unofficial, right? Because it's coming from this committee. It's not legislation. It's they are not the executive. And then the other thing is they then come in and say, oh, and by the way, guess who's coming to Washington? We've got several of the very visible leaders among the constellation of people representing all of the protester groups. They're coming and they're going to explain to us just what is going on. And in the process, gave them the platform through which they could begin to develop discursively, right, their own narrative of the Hong Kong situation as against the discursive position that had already begun to be developed by the central authorities from way back in June. So that's what made this kind of interesting.
Does this have the effect of maybe pulling in the protesters under the umbrella, maybe not away from the international community, but where we saw 3 different umbrellas originally, would it bring the Americans and the protesters in greater alignment through these meetings and this statement?
Well, it does, and that's a loaded question. And I can hear the question you did not ask. I can hear the question you did not ask in that question. Yes, an alignment. And that can be a poison chalice, right? And we've already seen this. So if the protesters are coming to Washington, is there a possibility that the central authorities can see in this an opportunity to do what? To blow up, to go bigger, and to make it more credible, the idea that the protests are actually being run out of Washington and they do not represent the heartfelt cultural and aspirations and social whatever of the people of Hong Kong itself. And in fact, one can identify these folks as creatures of the Americans, and therefore it behooves the central authorities with the local authorities to find Hong Kong patriots whose own sentiment central authorities have a responsibility to protect, and then to throw out the evil black hand of foreign interference. And of course, I'm foreshadowing what may come, but that's the risk. On the other hand, that while that is a risk from the perspective of the Americans now appearing to lead the reconstruction of the meaning of the internationalism that Hong Kong represents, it probably would have appeared to be, I'm being very careful here, appeared to be useful to not interpose their own discourse on Hong Kong, but instead to appear to align their discourse, their internationalist discourse, within the framework of Chinese sovereignty, now constrained, but Chinese sovereignty over Hong Kong, to align it with those with that aspirational discourse of the protesters themselves. And so in that context, it made plenty of sense to bring them. But again, right, this balances out, and only time will tell. It's towards the second, we're into the second half of September, and it's way too early at this point which way it's going to go, but you're gambling. So you've taken your dice, you've thrown them. But you have a choice. If you didn't throw the dice, then this thing was, you already knew the way this thing is going to go from the perspective of the Americans and the international community, and bleating a little like a little baby lamb the way G7 did was not going to do a thing. Certainly, if I had read the G7 statement, my offices in Beijing, I would have, okay, fine, we can make this, we can sort that one out. So there had to be something more than that, but that's always risky. And so here we go, the dice thrown. And here, this dice that has been thrown now drags the G7 in with them to some extent by crafting a meaning onto what had been a careful, if somewhat bland and directionless statement, and draws everyone in, which is, I think, what they wanted to do. But anyway, so there it is. But yeah, it's it's gamble time here.
It may have affirmed a position of leadership within the international community in some ways. But one more thing I wanted to
and it's not just leadership within the international community, and then it also, right, speaks to the influence of this organization, right, CECC, within the context of influencers of American policy as well. So, you've got all of these conversations sort of going on at the same time.
And that goes into my next question, actually. I was going to say, you may have already touched on this a little bit, but in what direction was the microphone of this message being pointed to? Who was this message directed to, or was it multiple groups? And where, what did you say?
Yeah, no, yes, everyone. And for everyone, there's a slightly different message, right? If they read this right. Now, I can't, I think, and quite correctly, be accused of giving CECC far more credit than it deserves. But that would be true only if one assumed that all of this was conscious. It is possible that all of this occurs because they, as prisoners of the logic of the institutions in which they are operating, the logic of those institutions would take care of the part and would have the effects, even if they did not, this complicated multi-vector effects, even if they didn't think it through in this complex, sophisticated way. But yeah, no, having said that, yeah, no, this is going in all kinds of directions. If they, as an opening shot, if and only if they then take all those opening shots and cultivate them assiduously the way the central authorities in China had been doing, right, with respect to their own discursive approaches and their communications to everyone over the course of the last 6 or 7 weeks of the weeks before. So, and in this case, we've already talked about some of the people that we've been talking to, right? The conversation with the Americans, the conversation with the Brits, the conversations with the international community, and the conversations not just with Chinese authorities, but now more importantly, the conversations with and among the protester communities as well.
Well, those are all the questions that I had for this chapter. Do you have anything else you would like to add to this discussion?
No, last little point in that is that it's worth reading here, and we'll pick this up later. It's worth reading the testimony of the key figures that were invited in, and you know, none of them are a surprise. It was Joshua Wong, Sunny Chung, Sharon Hom, you know, these folks, and Denise Ho. These folks really went a long way to begin to crystallize for the Americans the way in which the protester positions were going to develop. But stay tuned for that.
Well, you said that that part is worth reading, and I'm going to say the whole book is worth reading for your call. But I do hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope all of our listeners out there are enjoying these pieces. It's the Olympic time. You got any shout outs? Anybody you've been watching?
No, just go for victory, whoever.
You're funny. All right. Well, thank you for talking with me again today, and I hope that everyone has a good day.
All right.